Hello and welcome to Complete World War II, Ultimate World War II Part 6. Now in Part 5, I concluded the campaign in Norway and the occupation of Denmark. So basically, this left now the Western Front. Now, as highlighted in Part 5, the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, had suffered some stunning reverses tackling the Royal Navy in the Battle for Norway. But ultimately, the Norwegian campaign had been a great success for the Wehrmacht. The French, British and Polish units that took part in the overall campaign, both supply and militarily, just did not seem to have the drive and the ability to counteract the German military moves. And this really symbolises what we're going into now, the Western Front. Now, as I've already highlighted in previous parts going through the World War II calendar, Adolf Hitler, towards the end of 1939, had already ordered the Wehrmacht to begin planning an offensive against France, I believe January 10th. That date was put back to January the 17th and then put back for an indefinite period, which we now later learn is indeed May. Now, two things about this, like I've said, first of all, Hitler had taken care of his problems, He'd taken Austria, the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, he'd dissected Poland with Russia, he'd now annexed Denmark, he'd now, ran a very successful campaign in Norway, backing up the very successful military campaign where the Polish large standing army was literally carved up and destroyed in concentrated attacks and encirclements. And really, Hitler had not really lost too much. The campaign, the Blitzkrieg tactics had shown that the Wehrmacht was now on a different playing field. When we look at the other parties when it comes to the war in France, I've always thought from everything I've researched that even though the French knew they had to fight Germany, they had to resist Germany, I always sometimes get this feeling that the real motivation to fight was not there like it should have been, that there were always doubts, that the traumas of World War I and the mass casualties suffered and the long protracted drawn out war kind of stymied the French resolve for a fierce fight against the Wehrmacht, whereas on the German side, Hitler, his general staff and his army were completely intent on destroying and occupying France, destroying the British forces in France, seizing the Low Countries. The absolute directive was to accomplish their goal, but the French always seemed to be going into the fight on a secondary standpoint, that they were fighting because they had to. And, this is very symbolic because, it is only, 20 plus years after World War I. The trauma of that war is still felt. Many of the more seasoned battle commanders and military commanders and leaders, political leaders, were people who fought in World War I. And World War I left an enormous scar, especially on the French psyche. And the Germans, with the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler had used that masterfully through the 20s into the 30s to build up a bitter and deep-seated resentment towards France. That even though Britain and America were involved in it too, that it was mainly the French who were at fault for the Treaty of Versailles that left Germany crippled, their economy crushed, and basically left them with a standing army of 100,000 men, no tanks, no aircraft, left Germany the equivalent of a third world country. So now Denmark and Norway have been taken care of. Hitler, aside from garrison forces and dealing with certain smaller issues, turned the full attention of the Wehrmacht onto the Western Front. And the planning for the attack that had actually been planned for January, the plans that were being looked at, now went into overdrive in the early months of 1940 as Hitler fine-tuned his plans. So basically what we're going to do, is just do a little video here, preempting the Battle of France, which would end up being another stunning victory for the Wehrmacht, potentially even more stunning than the Polish campaign. This campaign was fought to a pinpoint battle plan for the most part, incredible military manoeuvres, encirclements, and basically France was overrun. We will get to the war in France in time. But at the moment, I just want to talk a little bit, about some of the French mentality, leading up to this. Now, in the First World War, we know that the Germans had used what was called the Schlieffen Plan, which involved mass German armies crashing through Holland and Belgium and then wheeling round in a big encircling move to encircle Paris. The idea was that they'd crash through Holland, Belgium, crash through northern France, and swing round back towards themselves, encircling Paris. Now, what happened in World War One, as we know, is that the French and British armies in France met the Germans, okay, and fixed them, in Belgium and northern France, basically pinned them there, and thus the war turned into a war of attrition. The Germans could not make any successful moves, not until, the later Ludendorff offensives with the shock troops and the new tanks and the aircraft. Really, nothing much moved for a long time. There were sporadic successes here or there, but the war became a fixed front war. And this is one thing that the German High Command and both the French and British did not want a repeat of. The French and British did not want the Germans to attack, stall them, and end up in another long, bitter, campaign. And the Germans wanted a quick victory. They did not want to lose hundreds of thousands or millions of lives in a static war on the Western Front, fighting Britain and France, because ultimately that would put off the more major plans Hitler had beyond gaining revenge on France. So basically, okay, the plain truth was that in 1940, okay, the French army was completely insufficiently equipped for the defensive war of which they were going. Now, in many ways, France and Britain were still going, okay, on the idea that the Germans would use Belgium and the Low Countries to swing through into northern France. And thus the British and French armies, the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, and the French armies already had a plan in motion where they would advance from forward positions into Belgium upon receipt of the German attack on the Low Countries to again try to fix them in there. Now, they'd already tried to send troops in there, tried to get permission to send troops in there, but King Leopold III, and the rulers of the Low Countries had refused them entry to station military troops there, as I've commented on a few times. But the French and British decided, the plan was worked out that as soon as the receipt of the German attack was there, they would move into Belgium to a fixed line of defensive positions along the major rivers in Belgium and prepare to meet the German advance and stop it head on. So in a way, they were kind of trying to react to this Western Front as they did in 1914, and it just wasn't going to work. The Germans were fighting from a totally different rulebook, but the French mentality, it demonstrated the French mentality was still, for a larger part, in World War I principles, and the Germans had shown in Poland they were fighting from a different rulebook. Now, basically, okay, the French, okay, the military was completely, to me, under-equipped. Even though France had a large military, they had a number of armoured divisions that had been created over time. They had large artillery forces. They had a much more modernised air force than Poland had. They still did not have the real motorised formations that the Germans would employ. So the French military doctrine during the interwar years, okay, basically relied on the idea of directed battle, okay, carefully regulated battle that would not result in huge casualties, where they would move and counter-move, but with the idea of trying to keep casualties to a minimum and not falling into the trap. Because, okay, French offensives in World War I at Alsace, the Ardennes and on the Sambre, and on the Marne, that cost over 110,000 dead, nearly 300,000 wounded in World War I. So the French army were very keen not to repeat those tactics, which would actually bring nothing but scorn, A, from government figures, and B, from the French public, who did not have the stomach for a long, drawn-out, static war. So basically, without completely renouncing the idea of going onto the offensive, the French relied on a defensive war, a reactionary battle against the Germans. And many of the French military chiefs, in 1939, in 1940, were experienced World War I campaigners. And, they wished to basically, fight along those principles. Now, in September 1939, okay, with General Guderian, okay, in a talk to Hitler, that basically coined the term tanks are a life-saving weapon. The one thing that the lessons of Polish campaign had made clear, is that if the French had reorganised and re-equipped their tank formations into a more modernised force, they would have been way more successful in tackling the Germans evenly on the ground. But sadly, they were not. The French armoured divisions were tied up in huge numbers of, heavy tanks, medium tanks, but, less mobile and less speedy designs than the German counterparts. So the French tanks, albeit impressive on firepower and armour, did not have the manoeuvrability and the speed to compete with the panzers in open conflict. This is summed up in 1921 by General Jean-Baptiste Etienne, the creator of what would be the later French armoured divisions. He basically called them assault artillery. So pretty much going along the line of tanks are infantry support, whereas the Wehrmacht now under Blitzkrieg were using tanks as a punch-through weapon to drive behind enemy lines and keep going, disrupting supply lines, damaging communications, leaving whole corps, divisions or armies completely cut off, disorientated, not knowing what's going on, while the motorised and infantry divisions come in, encircle them and mop them up. Whereas the French thought, we'll mass as infantry, the tanks will be there to support. But that kind of plan would not have really held back the panzers, who used their tanks in much more narrow, confined, concentrated formations. Now, at the same time, General Paul-André Mastro, was pleading, the case for getting more tracked and motorised artillery, which would, with the new French armoured formations built up prior to the war, would have been a much more successful way of supporting the tanks during any armoured push. But sadly still, a number of the French artillery was still horse-drawn. They had mechanised and motorised to an extent, but the French still had quite a large number, of artillery that was horse-drawn. And they had 6 armoured divisions, They had 6 armoured divisions and other motorised divisions. But really, the French armoured formations were just not equipped to face the German counterparts. Now, another problem with France was that France, after World War I, had created something called the Maginot Line, which was a concentrated set of fortifications, gunning emplacements that manned the German-French frontier. Now, the Germans beat the Maginot Line mainly by bypassing it, striking through the Low Countries, striking through Luxembourg, as we will get to. But basically, Guderian, back in the early 30s, had been appointed Chief of Staff to Inspector of Motorised Troops, in the German army. So basically, it was General Guderian's job to modernise and gain the most modern equipment for the armed forces and ready for the new tactics of Blitzkrieg. Now, under Guderian's direction, small units, with basically dummy tanks were armed with wooden guns. They carried out a lot of manoeuvres, against infantry and cavalry, discovering and learning lessons of how these forces would, meet on a battlefield and what the possible outcomes would be. So basically, they set up dummy guns and dummy tanks and then engaged them in mock combat with infantry and cavalry to see what the outcomes would be. Now, certain episodes in World War I were studied, They studied the prior strategy in World War I, the Germans, to see what lessons they could learn, what modifications they could make to the plan, to see if they could come up with a better way of taking the Low Countries and making deeper penetrations into France. Now, basically, if the Germans, had tanks in 1914, then they would have obviously made a much larger imprint, but the British and French tanks in 1917-18, they were a very close infantry support weapon. They had no artillery, they had very little air cover. They were used literally as a battering ram to try and overrun enemy positions, enemy trench areas, simply to gain ground and break the stalemate, but the Germans were using tanks as a penetration weapon. Now, all of the considerations from what they learnt from World War I convinced General Guderian, to recommend that the army should be organised into larger mechanised brigades. So basically, you had all the equipment, You had, the tanks, the medium and light tanks. You had the trucks and other mechanised units. You had the infantry attachments to the tanks. You had a combined air force, also working in unison with the tank formations to create a battering ram, but a battering ram that had its own artillery, its own infantry, its own motorised segments, its own tanks, and then air force detachments to protect, whereas the French thought that the tanks were more a single-use weapon that would be used to simply complement infantry where they were needed, and this was a fatal flaw when facing the German formations. Now, General Guderian had actually commanded the 5th Cavalry Division in the war in 1914, so he was well aware of the effect of cavalry on combat and then how the new tanks would merge with that. He was an actual cavalry commander. Now, one thing about some people in German army, they disapproved of Guderian's plan and thought that they should use the tanks more as a World War One device, infantry support to overrun enemy positions only, backed by the infantry in unison with infantry. But, you know, thankfully Guderian won that argument, and as we saw in Poland in 1939, the panzers were very, very efficient. Now, when Germany first went to war, okay, just prior to September 1939, you know, they had 6 panzer divisions. Each one averaged over 300 tanks. Now, another 4 were formed, okay, the 6th, 7th, 8th and 9th panzer divisions. They were formerly mechanized divisions, light divisions that were converted into tank divisions. So the Germans now had 10 tank divisions, okay. They had a number of motorized divisions. So the combined total, they had 17 divisions that were organized into 3 army corps, and these were of tank and motorized units. These were big sledgehammers to punch a hole in enemy lines. Now, Hitler believed that the meteorological signs on January 10th were that an attack, you know, was fully justified, okay? But during the coming days, like I explained, you know, they eventually decided against that, and it was put off indefinitely, and it was the best thing. Now, also, okay, in the lead up to the invasion of France, you know, there were also plans that were captured. I mentioned that German plans were captured. You know, these plans, okay, with a statement that the veil had been ripped apart by General von Overstrattenen, okay, in his diary after the discovery of the plans being taken. You know, and it comprised many orders for the German army that the Allied forces intercepted. Luftflotte 2, okay, the 2nd Luftwaffe Air Corps, was to support the German army in the west, okay, that would take offensive between the North Sea and the Moselle. You know, they'd have heavy support from the Air Force across the territory of Belgium and Luxembourg, with the effect that they could penetrate and tie up as many French units as possible, you know, deal with and take the fortresses of Liege, etc., with encirclements. Now, basically, the 8th Flieger Corps, okay, must use part of its forces to support a landing by 7th Airborne Division on day attack, so the Germans were going to use paratroopers, okay, in the attack. This would seize key bridges and key areas, okay, and also to attack some of the older forts and concentrated defence lines. But this was only the preamble. Many German staff were very hesitant about this campaign. They were hesitant they were going to get bogged down, and they were hesitant that the war would turn out into a long, protracted campaign, as in World War One. The French army was a very large army, and they had elements of British Expeditionary Force there, 10 divisions of British troops there, like I've demonstrated on video. They were already starting to move corps of infantry with their equipment through to France long before the attack on France. But this is when, okay, General Erich von Manstein, okay, sent memorandums. He was sending memorandums, and he came up with a plan that was then adopted, okay, and it was called Manstein's Master Plan. Now, what this involved is an area on the front in Luxembourg called the Ardennes, okay, a heavily forested region, mountainous hilly region with poor roads. Now, the Ardennes was seen as an area where a massed tank force would not be able to penetrate. The German army would not be able to use the Ardennes. It was seen as very limited strategic value because it was impassable to a large tank formation or motorised army, or so it was thought. But General Erich von Manstein came up with the plan. So basically, this plan, okay, the directive, okay, aimed at bringing Army Group A to the Meuse at Sedan. Okay, Manstein then believed that the revised attack would only make sense if driven home on the left bank of river, so as he saw it, those were objectives which should be given to Army Group A, while one army on the south of the front acts as a flank guard the whole operation by taking up an approximate position on line, you know, Carrigon-Thionville. It is essential that another army, having crossed the Meuse at Sedan, drives to the south west. Okay, this attack will defeat any attempt by enemy to re-establish himself between the Aisne and the Oise by counter-attacking, and it will throw the enemy south of the Aisne into semi-disarray. The Second Army would also assist the redeployment of the northern wing, Army Group B, towards the south. Manstein's master plan then consigned a Third Army, forcing line of the Meuse between Dinant and Famay, and then will drive towards St. Quentin to take part in the flanking manoeuvre attack on the enemy forces retreating to the Somme before the advance of the northern wing. And even if all that failed, it'd still clear the way to the Somme for the northern wing. Manstein actually said that these movements of armies and repositioning of armies in Belgium and northern France was the only way they could execute a plan that would result in a quick, decisive victory over the French and British forces. Now, in Germany, okay, Germany had Army Group B. Okay, Army Group B was in northern Germany. Army Group B included 29 divisions. Below Army Group B was Army Group A. Now, that was the main power. Now, Army Group B included 3 panzer divisions. Army Group A's 45 divisions coming in through Luxembourg and eastern Belgium was the main tank force. Okay, that comprised 7 of the 10 panzer divisions that would be used in Manstein's master plan to provide the punch. Well, Army Group C would face off against the Maginot Line and a large French defence forces. Now, basically, the French-German border was where the largest bulk of French troops were. So Manstein's master plan, coming through Luxembourg and southern Belgium in a sweeping movement towards the English Channel, pretty much bypassed the entire southern French defences. The main bulk of French infantry, they had a sizable force on the Belgian border, but the main bulk of French infantry was actually facing the German border at the Maginot Line, etc., etc. So actually, Manstein's master plan would come north of the main concentration of French troops and swing right past them, and in an arching manoeuvre head straight up to cut off the French and British troops that advance into Belgium, cut them off, encircle them. So this really was a master plan. It was a plan that was very meticulously planned. The German 18th Army would advance into southern Holland. The German 6th and 4th Armies, they would advance into Belgium, past Maastricht and past Liege, while the 12th Army, Panzer Group Kleist, with the Panzer and motorised divisions, they would come through northern Luxembourg, through the Ardennes, head to Sedan. When they reached Sedan, they'd head to St. Quentin, then they'd head up towards Abbeville, and then swing up north to St. Omer. Thus cutting off, the French 9th Army, parts of the French 2nd Army, the French 1st Army, the French 7th Army, and the British Expeditionary Force, pin them in a massive encirclement and suddenly leave them closed in on both sides by Army Group B and A, coming down through the Low Countries, Holland and Belgium from the north and east. Thus, Army Group A swung around at the back with the panzers, cut them off, so suddenly the BEF and a chunk of the French forces was completely encircled, which would leave the route to Paris completely wide open once the panzers were re-equipped, except for the small amount of French reserve divisions, of course. So basically, Hitler backed the Manstein plan. So Army Group B and elements of Army Group A would move into Belgium and Holland. The panzers, the main concentration of panzers, would punch through northern Luxembourg, bypassing, a large chunk of the French 3rd Army, 4th Army, 5th Army and 8th Armies that were manning the German border. The largest concentration of French divisions would thus go right north of them, not even having to engage them, and look to encircle the French and British along the English Channel. So this was the plan that was set in motion. This was an opposite of the Schlieffen plan. The Schlieffen plan involved large-scale movements of forces going around Belgium, but actually what this did is it kind of lulled the Allies, the French and British, into this idea that when the Germans attacked East Belgium and Holland, the Allied forces would advance, that it would show that the Germans were following the same pattern coming through the Low Countries. But then as the French and British advanced northeast, the panzers under Kleist would smash through the Ardennes, Luxembourg, swing around by Sedan and head to the coast, cutting them all off. They were basically being pulled like a vacuum into a trap, and then the Germans would swing around the back of them, cutting them off, completely encircling them. Now, basically, okay, from November 1939, Gamelin came around to the idea that the 7th French Army should be put in the line between the Schelde at Antwerp and the Maar. And it seemed at the time that Holland was more directly threatened than Belgium. There were a concentration of German forces facing the Holland border, but they didn't realise the threat coming through the Ardennes. So they were still fixated on that the Ardennes was not much of a security risk militarily, that the Germans would only be able to launch, small-scale incursions through the Ardennes, when actually the main panzer force would come through the Ardennes and northern Luxembourg. So again, the French completely went on this idea that, right, we're on the Belgian border. King Leopold has refused numerous times to allow us and the British to move our troops into Belgium to stop and engage the Germans. But as soon as the German attack comes, we will give orders for our troops to move forward. And we will pin them in there. Holland had a small army. Holland only had like 8 main divisions, and Belgium had like 18 divisions, but these divisions were poorly equipped, quite antiquated in a way, had substandard equipment, and were never going to pose anything more than just, slight resistance to German forces. Now, the Dutch and Belgians, okay, they gained quite a bit of friction in this time because these big powers are moving around them. Out of a population equivalent to that of Belgium, Holland had raised an army of 9 divisions. Each of them were considerably less well equipped with artillery than the Belgian counterparts, and they had 1 light division, okay, of cycle troops. Now, forced to rely on such restricted resources, Dutch High Command, even with deliberate sacrifice of Friesland, could not hope to defend the line between the Kampen and the Zuider Zee, Arnhem, Nijmegen and Roermond areas, while the troops falling back as soon as German pressure became too strong. Behind this outpost line, 2 defence lines had been set up, relying on a combination of water barriers and light fortifications, which would have done very little to stop the panzers. From Baan, on the south shore of the Zuider Zee, to the River Lek, the northern branch of the Dutch Rhine, ran the Greb line, okay, crossing the Waal, or another branch of the Rhine, and extending up the Maar as far as Grave, ran the Peel line, which ended up at Weert on the Belgian border. From Weert to Hasselt, across the Belgian border, there was a gap of 25 miles. So even in the Dutch and the Belgian forces' dispositions, they'd actually left a 25-mile wide gap that were held only by light Belgian forces. So between Dan Helder and the mouth of the Maar, 2 Dutch divisions were stationed, 7 more were placed between Baan and Weert, holding a line of 94 miles. So them 7 divisions held a front of 94 miles, which is crazy. There's nowhere near enough troops to hold that line, and they should have really looked at trying to find a better defensive line using natural river barriers, because they were never going to stop the German attack based on that. So basically, okay, let's now look at this. So on May 10th, 1940, okay, land forces at Wehrmacht had grown substantially from the attack on Poland. They now comprised 157 divisions, 49 divisions more than what they had when they attacked Poland. Okay, now the organisation of this was also far superior. The French had Dettween 520 and Block 151 fighters. They were quite good aircraft in some ways, but they'd not been in production, and not been in production to the numbers of the Messerschmitt Bf 109s, and although good planes, there were still far too few. Now the Spitfires and Hurricanes, okay, which were, pretty much kept in Britain. They did have some light bombers, Fairey bombers and other fighter aircraft in France, and of course the RAF had fly sorties over the English Channel, but basically there were not enough British planes in France either. It was all adding up, okay, to an absolute quagmire of doom. The Luftwaffe had 3,600 frontline aircraft of all types. They had over 1,000 fighter aircraft. Now, on the ground, okay, the Allies fielded 9 Dutch, 22 Belgium, 10 British, and 94 French divisions. So, in number, they virtually matched the Germans, coming in with 135 divisions of all kinds to Germany's 136 divisions. But we also have to remember that many of these divisions were poorly equipped, were non-motorised, still relying on horse-drawn artillery, etc., where the Germans were now a much more mechanised, fluid-moving force. Now, the Dutch Air Force, okay, was negligible. Belgium had about 50 modern fighters, okay, and some of these were Belgian Hurricanes, and they were the only planes the Belgians had that would really be able to take on the Messerschmitt Bf 109s. The French, okay, had 418 Morane Saulnier 406, and a number of modern bombers and fighters. The RAF had 130 fighters and 160 bombers and 60 reconnaissance aircraft. So the German Luftwaffe clearly outnumbered the Allied air power by a huge amount, not only in numbers but also in modernisation. Incredible, really. That even though the Allies saw what happened in Poland, it was still, too late for them to really do anything. Germany had been modernising since the early 30s. France and Britain, in some respects, had dwindled along, had not put modernisation at military as a top priority, whereas in Nazi Germany, modernisation and building a modern, efficient military was the priority because Hitler had plans of conquest long before the war broke out. So they received a last warning, a last warning. Now, German intelligence, started making urgent inquiries, into the state of the major roads along the Sedan-Abbeville axis. Questions include the width of the bridges, the appearance of the banks, the depths of the watercourses, and the state of the roads. Now, it was from a reliable informant, this information, and all the information on base the location, North Luxembourg, South Belgium, and the Ardennes, showed that where the Germans were concentrating would probably lead to an attack across Belgium in the direction of the English Channel and the North Sea, which is exactly what General Erich von Manstein's plan was, to bypass the Maginot Line, to bypass the bulk of the French infantry on the German border, and to encircle the French and British forces in Belgium and northern France. Now, this was ignored. Now, on April 30th, French military attaché in Switzerland cabled to Vincennes, saying the German army will attack along the whole front, including the Maginot Line, between 8th and 10th of May. The region of Sedan, Belgium and Holland and northern France will be occupied in a week, and France within a month. So basically, the Germans had said in their plans they estimated to encircle the BEF and French armies in Belgium within a week, and for France to fall in a month. Now, France lasted a little bit longer, but not much longer. Now, that certainly gave an impetuousness with the mention of Sedan and the tank columns and wanting information on bridges, river barriers, natural obstacles. They were clearly looking to make an offensive punch in that area, but this was completely ignored, and it should also have been taken as a clear warning to Allies that the Germans were not going on a modified version of the Schlieffen plan, which had been their original plan. So everything is getting set up now. So quite apart from that, there's always a considerable time lag, when involved in considering intelligence reports on an enemy's intentions. They had no idea if these orders were new or whether they were a month old or whatever. But basically, Hitler, who had changed his plans in January and put them off, they did not know whether these plans would also be put off or whether the main thrust would be through the Low Countries. So they were left in it. Now, it is true that suggestion made by King Leopold on March 8 and emphasised by Colonel Palloy on March 22nd should have been accepted as one of possible moves the Germans were likely to make, but this was rejected. They didn't feel the Ardennes and Luxembourg was a major military risk due to the thought of impassable Ardennes region, and that was their fatal mistake. So the possibility of holding a German attack between Namur and Sedan should have been studied, but it was not. And if this had been done, basically the Breda manoeuvre, the advance into Belgium by the BEF and French forces, would have had to be completely redone. Now, in refusing to make this essential revision, Gamelin was flouting a principle laid down by the great General Napoleon Bonaparte himself, where Napoleon said, "A commanding general must ask himself several times each day, if the enemy appeared on my front, on my right or on my left, what would I do? If he finds any trouble, his dispositions are wrong. He's off balance and he must put matters right." So basically, the French, upon receiving receipt of this information of an attack, possible heavy attack through the Luxembourg, the Ardennes, towards Sedan and the English Channel, was ignored. And what Napoleon's saying there is every day you look at your army, you look at the left, you look at the right, you look at the centre. What can happen? If you find any problems, you need to rebalance and deal with it. They were too busy with the problems of meeting the Germans in Belgium and the Low Countries, and paid little attention to the Ardennes region, and that was their fatal flaw. So let us just go through, okay, before I finish, let us go through more of the combatants involved and the disposition of forces and equipment. So, okay, German Army Group B, which would enter through Holland and northern Belgium, okay, comprised 29.5 divisions. 3 of them were armoured. They were deployed on northern tip at Dutch frontier as far as Aachen, and from Aachen to Trier, okay, was General von Rundstedt's Army Group A. That was the army with the bulk of the panzer divisions, 7 of them included in their 45 divisions overall. They also had 3 motorised divisions. And from Trier to the Swiss border was General Lieb's Army Group C that only had 19 divisions. So the Germans put over 70 divisions on the border of Luxembourg, Belgium and Holland, but only left 19 divisions, manning the French frontier against the larger bulk of the French divisions which were placed facing them. But you see, the Germans already had the plans in motion. All they needed to do on the south in Army Group C region on French border was be there to stop any potential counter-attack by France. But by the time the attack came through the Ardennes and when the French and British realised what's happening, that would be the last thing on their minds. Now, German Army Group A contained nearly half of Germany's infantry divisions, 7 of the 10 available panzer divisions, and they had 42 reserve divisions as well. Some of these were new divisions, but they were very enthusiastic soldiers, very well equipped, and getting ready to jump in onto the fight. Now, on the other side at frontier stood 3 armies. The Dutch in north had 8 divisions and a few in reserve. The Belgians had 18 divisions deployed roughly opposite German Army Group A. So the initial attack, okay, Belgium only had 18 divisions facing off, German Army Group A's 45 divisions. And of course, the German divisions were way more reinforced. So, now on the other side at frontier, okay, stood the French 7th Army, okay, and elements of the 9 divisions of the British Expeditionary Force, commanded by General Lord Gort. They were from Belle-Isle to Molde. From there to Lugan, the French 1st Army had 22 divisions, including 2 mechanised under the command of General Gaston Bilot, and from Longueuil to the Swiss frontier, the French 2nd and 3rd armies, commanded by Generals Pretelat and Besson, and consisted 35 and 14 divisions, so nearly 50 of the French divisions were on the border of Germany. They had 22 divisions in reserve, including 3 armoured divisions, but they will play little part in the war, as I will demonstrate in the attack on France. So in figures, the total number of forces in the field accounted for 2.9 million troops for the Dutch, the Belgians, the French and the British Expeditionary Force. The Germans had just over 2.7 million, so a very slight numerical advantage to the Allies. The Allies had just over 2,500 tanks in the field and just over 2,000 aircraft. So Germany, to counter that, had also roughly 2,600 tanks, so very minimal advantage there. But the Germans did have over 3,200 aircraft, which was superior to the numbers of just over 2,000 Allied aircraft. So the Germans had a slim numerical disadvantage in infantry, although their troops were much more equipped and trained for blitzkrieg tactics. They had a similar number of tanks, but again, many French tanks were slow and less manoeuvrable, and the Panzer Mark IIIs were much more manoeuvrable and fast. The Panzer I and IIs were very good infantry support, but also very quick. But in the air, the Germans had advantage of nearly 1,000 aircraft. So basically this plan, okay, the French and British deliberating over whether to fight a World War I campaign, moving to Belgium when the Germans attacked the Low Countries. The Germans anticipating that and planning a remodified Schlieffen plan. Then they anticipated this move from the French and the British that led to Manstein's coming up with the idea of attacking through the Ardennes. Gave the Germans the perfect pinpoint plan to lure the BEF and the French forces into Belgium, encircled them with a rapid tank thrust through the Ardennes toward the English Channel, thus bypassing the bulk of the French infantry divisions. And by the time the French infantry divisions on the German border realised what was happening, the entire British, French, Dutch and Belgian forces would be in complete disarray. So that is the build-up to the battle. That is the list of the list of forces involved and equipment involved. This battle to come is another stunning victory for the Wehrmacht. You know, they do not anticipate the attack through the Ardennes. And even years later, back in 1944, in time to come that we will go through, this time they thought they couldn't pass the Ardennes with tank formations and motorised formations because it was impassable. In 1944, for the Battle of the Bulge, they now accepted that area was passable to massed German tank formations, but whereas in 1940 the German army was well equipped, they believed the German army in 1944 was not well equipped enough with gasoline and supplies and equipment to do the same thing again, and the Germans hit them right again in 1944. But thankfully Allied air power and the dogged resistance of British and Americans stopped it being a repeat. But they even fell for the same tactic 4.5 years later and attacked through the Ardennes that they didn't anticipate. But we're now all set up. Okay, there's no else to do. Part 7 will begin the invasion of France and the Low Countries by the Wehrmacht as Hitler seeks revenge. Okay, revenge on those who imposed the Treaty of Versailles on Germany. I'm out for now.